Elena Martinez had always been different, though she never understood why until the night everything changed. Working late at the university library, she felt eyes watching her from the shadows between the ancient bookstacks. The sensation sent chills down her spine, but when she turned to look, nothing was there except darkness and the musty smell of old leather bindings. She had been researching medieval folklore for her thesis on supernatural legends when the accident happened 3 months ago. A car crash that should have killed her, yet she walked away without a scratch while the other driver didn't make it. Since then, strange things kept happening around her. Lights flickered when she was upset. Mirrors sometimes showed reflections that moved independently, and she could hear whispers in languages she didn't recognize. The whispers grew stronger as autumn settled over the small college town of Millbrook. Elena tried to ignore them, focusing on her studies and her part-time job at the local bookstore, but ignoring the supernatural world that seemed to be calling to her became impossible when she met him. Adrian Blackthorne appeared on a Tuesday evening when rain drummed against the library windows. Elena was alone in the historical research section, surrounded by towers of books about ancient bloodlines and forgotten kingdoms. She looked up from a particularly fascinating account of medieval vampire courts to find a man standing at the end of a table, watching her with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of knowledge. He was tall and elegant, dressed in a perfectly tailored black coat that looked expensive yet timeless. His dark hair was swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble, with sharp cheekbones and pale skin that seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. But it was his eyes that captured her attention completely. They were the deepest blue she had ever seen, like looking into an ocean at midnight, and they held a sadness that made her heart ache. "You're reading about my people," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. It was smooth and cultured, the kind of voice that belonged to someone accustomed to being obeyed. Elena blinked, certain she had misheard. "Your people? The Nightwalkers. The Blood Drinkers. The ones your human scholars have spent centuries trying to understand." Adrian moved closer, his footsteps completely silent on the library's worn carpet. "Though most of what they've written is complete nonsense, I'm afraid." She should have been afraid. Every instinct should have been screaming at her to run, but instead, Elena felt a strange sense of recognition, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. "You're telling me you're a vampire?" "I am telling you that I am Adrian Blackthorne, King of the Northern Territories, ruler of 7 vampire courts, and keeper of the ancient bloodlines that stretch back over 2,000 years. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down with fluid grace. "And you, Elena Martinez, are not entirely human." The words hit her like a physical blow. Elena gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "That's impossible, is it?" Adrian leaned forward, his intense gaze never leaving her face. "Tell me, have you noticed anything unusual since your accident? Dreams that feel more real than waking life? An ability to sense things others cannot? A growing awareness that the world is far stranger than you ever imagined?" Elena's mouth went dry. How could he possibly know about any of that? "How do you know about my accident?" "Because I felt it happen." Adrian's expression grew serious. When someone with dormant supernatural blood experiences a near-death event, it sends ripples through our world. Every supernatural being within a 100-mile radius felt the surge of power that night. Most ignored it. But I had to find the source. This is insane. Elena started gathering her books, her hands shaking slightly. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not interested." Adrian's hand shot out faster than her eyes could follow, gently but firmly covering hers. His touch was ice-cold, yet it sent warmth racing through her entire body. "Please, let me explain. Your grandmother, Maria Santos, she was one of us, a Dampier, born of both human and vampire blood. She chose to live as a human, to marry your grandfather and have a normal life. But the bloodline doesn't simply disappear." Eleanor stared at him in shock. Her grandmother had died when Eleanor was 12, but she remembered the woman's strange habits clearly. How she only came to visit at night. How she seemed to know things before they happened. How mirrors in their house always seemed to cloud over when she was around. Her parents had always dismissed these things as eccentricities of old age, but now my grandmother was not a vampire. Elena whispered, though even as she said it, doubt crept into her voice. "Not a full vampire, no. But she carried the blood, and so do you. The accident awakened what was always sleeping inside you." Adrian released her hand but didn't lean back. "You have felt it, haven't you? The changes? The growing awareness that you no longer quite fit in the human world?" Elena couldn't deny it anymore. For months she had been feeling increasingly isolated from her friends and classmates, Conversations that once engaged her now seemed trivial and meaningless. She found herself staying awake later and later, feeling most alert and alive during the darkest hours of the night. And then there were the dreams, vivid and intense, filled with images of castles and courts and figures in flowing dark clothing, who bowed when they saw her. "What does this mean?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "It means you are coming into your inheritance," Adrian replied, "and it means you are in great danger. There are those in our world who would see your bloodline as a threat to the established order. Others who would try to use you for their own purposes. You need protection, guidance, and training, and you're offering all of that?" For the first time since he had appeared, Adrian's composed expression faltered slightly. "I am offering you sanctuary in my domain. My castle lies in the mountains north of here, hidden from human eyes by magic that has protected it for centuries. You would be safe there while you learn to control your emerging abilities." Elena studied his face carefully. Despite his formal speech and aristocratic bearing, she could see something vulnerable in his expression, a loneliness that called to something deep inside her.
"Why would you do that for a stranger?"
"Because," Adrian said quietly, "you are not a stranger. Your grandmother and I, we knew each other long ago. I made her a promise that if anything ever happened to awaken the bloodline in her descendants, I would ensure their safety. I have waited 60 years to honor that promise." The revelation left Elena reeling. Her practical mind insisted this was all an elaborate delusion, but her heart recognized the truth in his words. Everything in her life that had never quite made sense suddenly fell into place. Her grandmother's mysterious past, her own sense of never quite belonging, the strange dreams and unexplained abilities that had been growing stronger since the accident. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. Adrian nodded, reaching into his coat and pulling out an elegant black card with silver lettering. "When you are ready, simply speak my name while holding this card. I will come to you, no matter where you are or what time it is." He stood, his movements graceful and controlled. "But do not wait too long, Elena. The supernatural world has taken notice of you now, and not all of its attention is benevolent." With that warning, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows between the bookstacks as silently as he had appeared. Elena sat alone at the table, staring at the card in her hands. The silver lettering seemed to shimmer in the fluorescent light, and she could swear she felt warmth emanating from the thick paper. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in her small apartment bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything Adrian had told her. Part of her wanted to dismiss it all as an elaborate hoax or the delusion of someone with severe mental health issues, but she couldn't shake the feeling that every word had been true. She thought about her grandmother, trying to remember details she had dismissed as a child. Maria Santos had been a woman of contradictions, elegant and refined, yet somehow wild and untamed. She had spoken several languages fluently and seemed to know about cultures and places she had never claimed to visit. Elena's parents had always said her grandmother was simply well-educated and well-read, but now she wondered if there had been a deeper explanation. As the hours passed, Elena became aware of sounds she had never noticed before. The building settling, her neighbors moving in their sleep, even the faint whisper of wind through the trees outside. It was as if her senses were becoming more acute, more sensitive to the world around her. By dawn, she had made her decision. The next evening, Elena returned to the library and found Adrian waiting in the same spot where they had met. He looked up from an ancient leather-bound tome as she approached, and she could see relief in his expression. "You came back," he said simply. "I need answers," Elena replied, sitting across from him. "If what you're telling me is true, if I really am part vampire, then I need to understand what that means. I need to learn how to control whatever is happening to me." Adrian closed the book and gave her his full attention. "What would you like to know?" "Everything. Start with my grandmother. Tell me about her real story." For the next several hours, Adrian painted a picture of a world that existed alongside the human realm but remained hidden from mortal eyes. He told her about vampire courts that governed supernatural territories, about ancient laws and customs that maintained the balance between species, and about the delicate dance of power and politics that kept their world from descending into chaos. Maria Santos, he explained, had been born to a human mother and a vampire father in the early 1900s. As a dhampir, she possessed many vampiric abilities but retained her humanity and could bear children. She had been groomed to take a position of importance in the supernatural court structure, but had fallen in love with Elena's grandfather during a mission to the human world. She chose love over duty. Adrian said, with something that might have been admiration in his voice. It was a scandal that reverberates through our world even today. A Dampier of her bloodline and power choosing to live as a human was almost unheard of. What kind of power? Elena asked. Dampiers often serve as bridges between our world and the human realm. They can sense supernatural presences, influence human thoughts and emotions, and possess physical abilities far beyond mortal limitations. Your grandmother was particularly gifted in what we call sight, the ability to see through illusions and perceive the true nature of any being she encountered.
Elena felt a chill of recognition.
Throughout her childhood, her grandmother had always seemed to know when Elena was lying or when she was troubled about something. She had assumed it was simply intuition or experience, but now she wondered if it had been something more. Is that what's happening to me? Am I developing these abilities? Among others, Adrian confirmed. The dreams you have been experiencing are likely visions of our world, images from the collective memory of the vampire bloodlines, the enhanced senses, the feeling of disconnection from normal human concerns. These are all signs that your Dampier nature is asserting itself. As Adrian continued to explain the intricacies of supernatural society, Elena found herself both fascinated and overwhelmed. The world he described was beautiful and terrible, filled with creatures of immense power and beauty, but also capable of great cruelty. It was a realm where immortal beings played games of influence and control that could span centuries, where a single word or gesture could shift the balance of power between entire territories. Where do I fit into all of this? She asked as the library began to empty around them. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes studying her face carefully. That depends entirely on what you choose to become. You could learn to suppress your abilities, live a relatively normal human life, and pass the bloodline onto your children in dormant form. Many Dampiers make that choice. Or you could embrace your heritage, learn to use your gifts, take your place in our world, perhaps even claim the position your grandmother abandoned. Adrian's voice grew softer. Your bloodline carries significant political weight, Elena. There are those who would see your return to our world as an opportunity for change, for new alliances and possibilities. The implications of what he was saying slowly sank in. Elena wasn't just discovering she had supernatural blood. She was apparently inheriting some kind of legacy that could affect an entire hidden world. The responsibility felt overwhelming. I think I need to see this world you're talking about, she said finally. I need to understand what I'm choosing between. Adrian nodded slowly. Then you will come to my castle? For a visit, Elena clarified. I'm not making any permanent decisions yet.
Of course.
Adrian smiled for the first time since she had met him, and the expression transformed his entire face. Gone was the formal, aristocratic mask, replaced by genuine warmth and something that looked like hope. When would you like to leave? Elena looked around the library one more time, at the books and papers that represented her old life, her human life. Everything she had thought she knew about herself and the world was changing, and there was no going back to the comfortable ignorance she had lived with for 23 years. Tomorrow night, she said, I'll need to make arrangements for my classes and work, but I can be ready by tomorrow night. As they made plans for her journey to his domain, Elena tried to ignore the voice in her head that whispered this was the most dangerous decision she would ever make. Adrian Blackthorne might be offering protection and answers, but he was still a centuries-old vampire king whose true motivations remained a mystery. Yet despite the rational fears, she felt an undeniable pull toward him and the world he represented. Something deep inside her recognized that this was what she had been unconsciously searching for her entire life, a place where she truly belonged, where the strange dreams and unexplained abilities finally made sense. Whether that recognition would prove to be wisdom or her downfall remained to be seen. The journey to Adrian's castle began at midnight, when the world belonged to shadows and secrets. Elena stood at the edge of Millbrook's town limits, a single bag containing her most essential belongings slung over her shoulder. The rational part of her mind screamed that she was making a terrible mistake, but her heart beat with anticipation rather than fear. Adrian appeared exactly when the church bells finished tolling 12, materializing from the darkness as if he had been woven from the night itself. He wore a long, dark coat that billowed around him despite the absence of any wind, and his eyes seemed to glow with an inner light that Elena found both mesmerizing and unsettling. Are you certain about this? He asked, though his formal tone couldn't quite hide the eagerness beneath it. Once you cross the threshold into our world, there is no pretending it doesn't exist. Elena adjusted her grip on her bag and met his gaze steadily. I'm certain. I need to know the truth about what I am, about what my life could become. Adrian nodded and extended his hand toward her. Then we travel as my kind travels, swift and unseen by mortal eyes. The moment Elena placed her hand in his, the world around them shifted and blurred. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Not quite flying, not quite falling, but something that existed between the two. Colors streaked past them in impossible patterns, while the landscape below rushed by at a speed that should have been terrifying, but somehow felt natural and exhilarating. They moved through forests and over mountains, past sleeping towns and darkened highways, until civilization gave way to wilderness that looked untouched by human presence. Elena lost track of time and distance, caught between wonder at the supernatural method of travel and amazement at the wild beauty of the landscape below. When they finally slowed, Elena found herself standing on a cliff overlooking a valley that seemed to exist outside of normal reality. Moonlight illuminated a castle that rose from the valley floor like something from a fairy tale, all soaring towers and gothic architecture that spoke of both beauty and power. Gardens and courtyards spread around the main structure, while lights flickered in dozens of windows, suggesting the presence of many inhabitants. "Welcome to Raven's Hollow," Adrian said, his voice carrying a note of pride. "Home to the Northern Court and sanctuary for those who serve under my protection." The castle was breathtaking, but as they descended into the valley, Elena became aware of other presences moving through the shadows. Figures glided along the garden paths with the same supernatural grace she had observed in Adrian, their movements too fluid and silent to be entirely human. Some paused to watch their approach with curious eyes that reflected the moonlight like those of nocturnal animals. "You're caught," Elena murmured, understanding beginning to dawn. "Some of them," Adrian confirmed. Ravenshollow is home to nearly 300 vampires, dumpiers, and other supernatural beings who have sworn loyalty to the Northern Territories. You will find that our society is more complex and varied than human legends suggest. As they approached the main entrance, massive doors carved with intricate designs swung open without any visible cause. Elena found herself in a grand entrance hall that took her breath away. The ceiling soared 3 stories above them, supported by columns of dark stone that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. Tapestries depicting scenes of supernatural courts adorned the walls, while a grand staircase curved upward toward the castle's upper levels. But it was the assembled crowd that captured Elena's attention completely. Dozens of beings filled the entrance hall, all of them beautiful in the otherworldly way she was beginning to associate with supernatural creatures. Men and women with pale, perfect skin, and eyes that held the weight of centuries, watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. "My lord returns," called out a woman with silver hair that cascaded down her back like liquid moonlight. She approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority, her emerald gown rustling against the stone floor. "And he brings the little Dampier we have heard so much about." Elena felt the weight of dozens of gazes upon her and fought the urge to step closer to Adrian for protection. Instead, she squared her shoulders and met the silver-haired woman's assessment with what she hoped was calm confidence. "Lady Vivian serves as my seneschal," Adrian explained, his hand moving to rest lightly on Elena's back in a gesture that somehow conveyed both support and subtle claim. "She manages the day-to-day affairs of the court and ensures that our laws and customs are properly maintained." Vivian's smile was sharp and beautiful, like the edge of a perfectly crafted blade. "Indeed, and I am quite eager to learn more about our unexpected guest. It has been many decades since a Dampier graced these halls, particularly one carrying such interesting bloodlines." The way she said interesting made Elena's skin prickle with unease, but before she could respond, another figure approached from the crowd. This one was male, tall and lean, with dark hair that fell in waves to his shoulders and eyes the color of amber honey. Unlike Vivian's barely concealed hostility, his expression was one of genuine curiosity and something that might have been welcome. "Lord Marcus oversees our external relations," Adrian said as the man stopped before them and executed a perfect bow. "He manages communications with the other courts and ensures our borders remain secure." "Welcome to Raven's Hollow, Lady Elena," Marcus said, his voice warm and cultured. "Your arrival has been the subject of much speculation. We are honored to finally meet the granddaughter of Maria Santos." Elena blinked in surprise. "You knew my grandmother?" "I had the pleasure of meeting her several times before she chose her path," Marcus replied. "She was remarkable, intelligent, powerful, and possessed of a strength of will that impressed even the most ancient among us. From what I have heard, those qualities run in the bloodline. Before Elena could ask what he meant by that, Vivian smoothly interjected. I am sure our guest is exhausted from her journey. Perhaps we should allow her to rest and recover before subjecting her to the full attention of the court. There was something in the way Vivian emphasized guest that suggested Elena's status was temporary and possibly unwelcome, but Adrian's response was swift and firm. An excellent suggestion. Elena will be staying in the East Wing, in the chambers adjacent to my own quarters. She is to be accorded all the respect and protection due to a member of my household. Murmurs rippled through the assembled court at this announcement. Elena caught fragments of whispered conversations in languages she didn't recognize, though somehow she understood the emotional undercurrents: surprise, speculation, and in some cases, disapproval. My lord, Vivian said carefully, perhaps it would be more appropriate to house the Dhampir with others of her kind. The East Wing is traditionally reserved for... The East Wing is reserved for those I choose to honor with my personal protection. Adrian cut her off, his tone carrying the unmistakable authority of absolute rule. Lady Elena will reside there for the duration of her stay.
The message was clear to everyone present. Elena was under Adrian's direct protection, and questioning that decision would be seen as challenging the Vampire King himself.
Vivian's smile never wavered, but Elena caught a flash of something dangerous in her emerald eyes before the seneschal inclined her head in acceptance. Of course, my lord. I will see to it that the chambers are prepared immediately. She turned to Elena with the same sharp smile. I do hope you will find our accommodations to your liking, Lady Elena. Life at court can be quite educational for those new to our ways. As the crowd began to disperse, Elena found herself both relieved to escape their scrutiny and apprehensive about what she had just witnessed. The dynamics at play in Adrian's court were clearly complex, with undercurrents of politics and power that she didn't yet understand. Come, Adrian said, guiding her toward the grand staircase. Let me show you to your chambers. Tomorrow evening, we will begin your education in earnest, but tonight you should rest. As they climbed the stairs, Elena caught glimpses of the castle's interior through open doorways and corridors. Everything spoke of wealth and refinement accumulated over centuries. Priceless artwork adorned the walls, while furniture that looked like it belonged in museums filled the rooms they passed. Yet despite the luxury, there was an otherworldly quality to everything that reminded her constantly that she was no longer in the human world. The East Wing proved to be a series of interconnected chambers that managed to be both opulent and surprisingly comfortable. Elena's bedroom featured a massive four-poster bed draped in midnight blue silk, while tall windows offered a view of the castle's gardens and the wild mountains beyond. A sitting room provided space for reading and relaxation, complete with a fireplace where flames danced without any visible fuel. These were your grandmother's chambers, Adrian said quietly as Elena explored her new surroundings. She stayed here for several months while she learned to control her abilities before she met your grandfather and chose her different path. Elena turned to study his face carefully. You cared about her. It wasn't really a question, and Adrian didn't try to deny it. Maria was unique. Powerful, yes, but more than that. She had a vision of what our world could become. A belief that the old ways of ruling through fear and isolation were no longer serving us well. Many in the supernatural community saw her ideas as dangerous, but I found them intriguing. What kind of ideas? Adrian moved to stand by the windows looking out over his domain. She believed that our survival as a species depended on evolution, on finding ways to exist alongside humans rather than in spite of them. She spoke of supernatural beings taking active roles in protecting and guiding human development instead of simply feeding off them or hiding from them. Elena joined him at the window, trying to imagine her practical, traditional grandmother as a revolutionary thinker in a world of immortal politics. Is that why she left? Because others disagreed with her? Partially. Adrian's expression grew distant, as if he was remembering events from long ago. But mostly because she met your grandfather and discovered that love could be more important than duty or destiny. It was a choice that surprised everyone, most of all herself. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the supernatural inhabitants of Raven's Hollow move through the gardens below. Elena could see figures engaged in what looked like training exercises, others deep in conversation, and some simply enjoying the beauty of the night. It looked almost normal, if one ignored the inhuman grace of the participants and the way shadows seemed to bend around them.
What happened after she left? Elena asked eventually.
Chaos for a time. Adrian's voice carried a note of old pain. Maria's departure created a power vacuum that several factions tried to fill. The ideas she had been developing were abandoned or corrupted by those who sought to use them for personal gain. It took decades to restore stability, and even now, there are those who believe her bloodline represents either a threat to the established order or an opportunity to reclaim her vision. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Which is why you said I was in danger. Among other reasons, yes? Adrian turned to face her fully, his blue eyes serious. Your very existence proves that Maria's bloodline survived. There are those who would see that as a chance to challenge the current power structure, others who would want to eliminate the threat entirely, and still others who would seek to control you for their own purposes. The weight of inherited responsibility settled on Elena's shoulders like a physical burden. She had come here seeking answers about her identity, but instead found herself caught in the middle of supernatural politics that had been brewing for decades before her birth. What do you want from me? She asked directly. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I want to keep the promise I made to your grandmother. I want to ensure your safety while you learn to control your abilities. And perhaps, if you are willing, I would like to explore whether Maria's vision of our future might still be possible. And if I decide I don't want any part of this world? If I choose to go back to my human life, then I will ensure you have the knowledge and protection necessary to make that choice safely. Adrian's voice was gentle, but Elena caught something in his expression that suggested her rejection would cause him significant pain. But I hope you will give our world a chance. Give yourself a chance to discover what you might become. Elena moved away from the window, needing space to think. Everything Adrian was telling her made sense intellectually, but emotionally she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was being asked to consider. A week ago, her biggest concern had been finishing her thesis. Now she was being told she could influence the future of an entire supernatural civilization. I need time to process all of this, she said finally. Of course. Adrian moved toward the door, then paused. One word of caution, Elena. Court politics can be treacherous, especially for those new to our ways. Trust your instincts and remember that not everyone who offers friendship has your best interests at heart. If you have questions or concerns about anything, please come to me directly. After he left, Elena sank into one of the elegant chairs by the fireplace and tried to sort through everything she had learned. The supernatural world Adrian had introduced her to was both more beautiful and more dangerous than she had imagined. The obvious tensions between court members suggested that her presence had already begun to shift delicate balances of power. But it was Adrian himself who puzzled her most. He clearly felt responsible for her safety and genuinely seemed to want to help her understand her heritage. Yet she sensed there was more to his interest than simple duty to an old friend. The way he looked at her sometimes suggested deeper feelings, though whether those feelings were about her specifically or about her connection to her grandmother remained unclear. As the night deepened, Elena found herself drawn back to the windows. The view of the supernatural court going about their nocturnal activities was mesmerizing, and she felt an unexpected sense of rightness about being here. For the first time in months, the restless energy that had been building inside her since the accident felt calm and settled. Perhaps that was answer enough for now. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and revelations, but tonight she was exactly where she needed to be. The castle around her hummed with power and possibility, and Elena allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to truly belong to this strange, beautiful, dangerous world. In the distance, she could hear the sound of music drifting from somewhere within the castle's depths, haunting melodies played on instruments she couldn't identify. The music seemed to call to something deep in her blood, awakening memories that weren't quite her own but felt familiar nonetheless. Whatever her ultimate decision about her place in this world might be, Elena knew that her old life was already becoming a distant memory. The woman who had sat in the library reading about supernatural legends was being replaced by someone stronger, more aware, and infinitely more complex. The transformation had begun, and there would be no turning back. Elena's education in supernatural society began the following evening with a formal introduction to the castle's inhabitants and their complex hierarchy. Adrian had arranged for her to meet with various court members throughout the night, each encounter revealing new layers of the intricate political web that governed their world. The first lesson came from an unexpected source, a young-looking woman named Celeste who appeared to be no more than 18 but spoke with the wisdom of someone far older. She served as the castle's librarian and keeper of ancient knowledge, and her domain was a vast underground chamber filled with books, scrolls, and artifacts that spanned millennia. The key to survival in our world, Celeste explained as she guided Elena through towering shelves of leather-bound volumes, is understanding that information is the most valuable currency we possess. A whispered rumor can topple kingdoms, while a well-placed secret can elevate the lowliest vampire to positions of significant power. Elena paused to examine a book written in symbols she couldn't read, though something about the flowing script seemed familiar. "How old are you, really?" Celeste smiled, her youthful features taking on an ageless quality. "I was turned during the reign of Elizabeth I, though I had been studying supernatural law for years before that as a human scholar. Knowledge has always been my passion, which is why Lord Adrian values my counsel on matters requiring historical perspective." They spent several hours discussing the basic structure of vampire society, with Celeste explaining how the various courts maintain their territories and relationships with each other. The northern territories that Adrian ruled were considered one of the more progressive domains, known for their relative tolerance of different supernatural species and their willingness to adapt to changing times. "Your grandmother's ideas were particularly well received here," Celeste noted as they settled into comfortable chairs in a reading alcove. "Lord Adrian has always been more open to innovation than many of his contemporaries, which is one reason why the other courts sometimes view him with suspicion." "What kind of suspicion?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "They believe he is too willing to compromise with humans, too accepting of change that might threaten the traditional power structures that have kept our kind safe for centuries." Celeste's expression grew serious. "There are those who see his protection of you as evidence that he is planning something that could upset the delicate balance between our courts." Elena felt a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. "Am I putting him in danger by being here?" "Lord Adrian is perfectly capable of handling any political pressure," Celeste assured her. "But you should be aware that your presence here is being closely watched by representatives from the other courts. Every interaction, every decision you make will be analyzed for its potential implications." The weight of constant scrutiny was daunting, but Elena forced herself to focus on learning rather than worrying about things beyond her control. Celeste proved to be an excellent teacher, patient and thorough in her explanations, while never making Elena feel foolish for her ignorance about supernatural customs and history. As the night progressed, Elena found herself increasingly fascinated by the complexity of the world her grandmother had abandoned. The supernatural courts maintained an intricate system of alliances, trade agreements, and territorial boundaries that rivaled any human government. Different species brought different abilities and perspectives to the community, creating a society that was diverse yet unified under common laws and traditions. "The Dampiers have always served crucial roles in our society," Celeste explained as they examined historical records of Elena's bloodline. "Your abilities to bridge the gap between human and vampire worlds make you valuable as diplomats, spies, and advisors. But those same abilities also make you dangerous to those who prefer clear distinctions between our species."
Elena studied a family tree that traced her lineage back through generations of powerful supernatural beings.
Names and dates told the story of a bloodline that had produced leaders, rebels, and visionaries throughout history. Her grandmother's name appeared near the bottom, followed by a notation that simply read, "Departed, 1962. "She really did just walk away from all of this," Elena murmured, trying to imagine the courage or desperation that would drive someone to abandon such a rich heritage. "Love makes people do extraordinary things," Celeste observed, though I suspect Maria's decision was also influenced by her growing belief that our traditional ways of hiding from humanity were becoming unsustainable. She saw the writing on the wall decades before the rest of us. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus, who appeared in the library doorway with the fluid grace Elena was learning to associate with all the castle's inhabitants. He offered a warm smile and a respectful nod to Celeste before turning his attention to Elena. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," he said, "but Lord Adrian asked me to escort you to dinner." The evening meal provides an excellent opportunity to observe court dynamics in a more relaxed setting. Elena bid farewell to Celeste and followed Marcus through a series of corridors toward what he described as the informal dining hall. Along the way, he provided a running commentary on the various court members they encountered, helping her understand the relationships and rivalries that shaped daily life at Raven's Hollow. "The key thing to remember," Marcus explained as they walked, "is that age doesn't necessarily correlate with power or influence in our society. Some of our most junior members wield considerable authority due to their particular abilities or connections, while some ancient vampires prefer to remain in the background and avoid political entanglements." The dining hall proved to be a surprisingly warm and welcoming space, with long tables arranged to encourage conversation and interaction. About 50 vampires and other supernatural beings were present, their animated discussions creating an atmosphere that felt more like a gathering of old friends than a formal court function. Elena noticed immediately that several conversations paused as she and Marcus entered the room. Eyes followed their progress toward a table near the front, where Adrian sat engaged in discussion with Vivian and several other elegantly dressed court members. He looked up as they approached, and Elena felt that now familiar flutter of attraction at the warmth in his blue eyes. "Elena," Adrian said, rising to pull out a chair beside him. "I trust Celeste provided you with a useful introduction to our history and customs?" "Very useful," Elena replied, settling into the offered seat and trying not to notice how Adrian's proximity affected her pulse rate, "though I'm beginning to understand why my grandmother might have found court life overwhelming." Vivian laughed, the sound like silver bells with a sharp edge. Maria Santos was many things, but overwhelmed was not one of them. She thrived in complex political situations and had a gift for reading people's true motivations. I suspect those abilities were passed along with her other gifts. There was something in the way Vivian said it that sounded almost like a challenge, but before Elena could respond, she was distracted by the arrival of the evening's meal. Unlike what she might have expected from a gathering of vampires, the food was varied and elaborate, with options clearly designed for both supernatural beings and those who maintained more human dietary needs. Contrary to popular belief, Adrian explained, noting her surprise, most vampires maintain the ability to consume regular food for both social and practical purposes. Blood sustains us, but shared meals strengthen social bonds and provide opportunities for the kind of informal diplomacy that keeps our society functioning. Elena found herself drawn into the conversation around their table, which ranged from discussions of territorial disputes with neighboring courts to debates about the best approaches for managing relationships with human governments. The breadth of topics was staggering, revealing just how interconnected the supernatural and human worlds really were. As the evening progressed, she began to understand why her presence had generated so much speculation. Several court members made subtle references to the potential for renewed cooperation with human institutions, while others spoke more cautiously about the dangers of drawing too much attention to their community. "The question," said an elegant vampire named Lord Aldrich, "is whether the modern world offers opportunities for greater integration or greater risk. Human technology has made it both easier and more dangerous for us to maintain our secrets, which is exactly why we need individuals who can navigate both worlds effectively," Marcus added, with a meaningful glance toward Elena. "The old strategies of complete separation are becoming increasingly impractical." Elena felt the weight of expectation in their words, the subtle pressure to declare her intentions regarding her role in their society. But she also sensed that rushing into commitments would be a mistake in a community where words carried such significant political weight. "I'm still learning," she said carefully. "It would be presumptuous of me to offer opinions about complex issues I don't yet fully understand." Adrian nodded approvingly at her diplomacy, while Vivian's expression suggested grudging respect for Elena's caution. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Elena remained aware of the undercurrents of evaluation and speculation that surrounded her every word and gesture. After dinner, Adrian offered to show Elena more of the castle's public spaces, and she gratefully accepted the chance to escape the intensity of constant observation. They walked through grand ballrooms and elegant parlors, each space decorated with artwork and furnishings that represented centuries of accumulated wealth and refinement. "You handled yourself well tonight," Adrian observed as they paused in a music room where several court members were engaged in an impromptu concert. Court politics can be treacherous for those who aren't accustomed to having their every word analyzed for hidden meaning. "It's exhausting," Elena admitted. "I feel like I'm walking through a minefield where one wrong step could have consequences I can't even imagine." "That feeling will pass as you become more familiar with our customs and personalities," Adrian assured her. "Though I confess there are times when I find court politics equally draining, and I've been dealing with them for over 800 years. Elena stopped walking and turned to stare at him. 800 years? How old are you exactly?" Adrian's smile held a hint of self-deprecation. "I was turned in 1186 during the Third Crusade. I've been king of the Northern Territories for approximately 6 centuries, though the title has evolved considerably over that time." The sheer scope of his existence was mind-boggling. Elena tried to imagine living through 8 centuries of human history, watching civilizations rise and fall while remaining essentially unchanged. "Don't you ever get tired of it all? The politics, the responsibility, the endless complications?" For a moment, Adrian's composed mask slipped, revealing something vulnerable beneath. "There are times when the weight of immortality feels overwhelming, yes. The loneliness can be particularly difficult, as can watching the human world change so rapidly while our society remains locked in traditions that may no longer serve us well." They had reached a balcony that overlooked the castle's gardens, and Elena found herself moved by the melancholy in Adrian's voice. Here was a man who had ruled for centuries, commanded the loyalty of hundreds of supernatural beings, and wielded power that most people couldn't even imagine. Yet beneath all that authority and responsibility was someone who struggled with the same fundamental questions about purpose and connection that plagued ordinary mortals. "Is that why my grandmother's ideas appealed to you?" Elena asked gently. "Because they offered a possibility for change?" "Partially," Adrian replied, his hands resting on the stone balustrade as he gazed out over his domain. "But also because Maria herself represented something I had never encountered before. Someone who could understand both the burdens of supernatural existence and the appeal of human simplicity. She offered a perspective that was neither fully vampire nor fully human, but something uniquely her own." Elena felt a pang of something that might have been jealousy at the obvious affection in Adrian's voice when he spoke about her grandmother. "You were in love with her?" It wasn't really a question, and Adrian didn't try to deny it. "I thought I was. Looking back, I believe I was more in love with the possibilities she represented than with Maria herself. She was remarkable, but she was also committed to her own vision of what her life should be. When she met your grandfather, I realized that what I felt for her was admiration and attraction, not the deep connection that true love requires." Alina studied his profile in the moonlight, noting the way shadows emphasized the sharp angles of his face and the centuries of experience reflected in his eyes. "What does true love require?" Adrian turned to look at her directly, his blue eyes intense and searching. "Recognition. The feeling that you have found someone who sees and understands you completely. Someone whose presence makes you feel more yourself rather than less. Someone whose happiness becomes more important than your own desires or ambitions." The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken tension, and Elena found herself stepping closer without conscious decision. There was something magnetic about Adrian's presence, a pull that went beyond physical attraction to touch something deeper in her supernatural blood. "Elena," Adrian said softly, his voice carrying a warning tone, "you should be careful about the connections you form here. The supernatural world can be as dangerous for the heart as it is for the body, and the consequences of emotional entanglements often extend far beyond the individuals involved." His words were clearly meant as caution, but Elena heard something else beneath them, a vulnerability that suggested he was struggling with his own growing feelings. The knowledge that this powerful ancient being might be developing feelings for her was both thrilling and terrifying. Before she could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Vivienne, who appeared on the balcony with the perfect timing of someone who had been watching and waiting for an opportunity to intervene. "My lord," she said smoothly, "I apologize for the interruption, but there are urgent matters requiring your attention. A messenger has arrived from the Eastern Court with news that cannot wait until tomorrow." Adrian's expression immediately shifted back to that of a ruler dealing with the responsibilities of leadership. "Of course. Elena, we should continue this conversation another time." As he and Vivienne departed, Elena remained on the balcony, her mind reeling from everything that had transpired over the course of the evening. The supernatural world was proving to be more complex and emotionally charged than she had imagined, and her growing feelings for Adrian only added another layer of complication to an already overwhelming situation. She was beginning to understand why her grandmother had found the choice between love and duty so difficult. The supernatural world offered power, purpose, and the chance to be part of something greater than herself. But it also demanded sacrifices and commitments that could shape the course of her entire existence. As Elena made her way back to her chambers, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was approaching a crossroads that would determine not just her own future, but the futures of everyone around her. 3 weeks into her stay at Raven's Hollow, Elena had settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural despite its supernatural elements. Her days were filled with lessons from various court members, each session revealing new aspects of the complex world she was slowly becoming part of. Celeste continued to educate her about supernatural history and law, while Marcus taught her about intercourt diplomacy and the delicate balance of power that kept their society stable. But it was her training sessions with Adrian himself that Elena found most challenging and rewarding. Every evening after the court's formal activities concluded, he would meet her in a private chamber deep within the castle, where she could practice developing her Dhampir abilities without fear of observation or judgment. "Your grandmother's bloodline carries particular gifts," Adrian explained as they stood facing each other in the center of the circular room. Candlelight flickered across the stone walls, creating dancing shadows that seemed to respond to their movements. Dhampirs often possess enhanced physical capabilities, but your family line specializes in what we call true sight, the ability to perceive the essence of any being or situation. Elena closed her eyes, as Adrian had taught her, focusing her awareness inward until she could feel the supernatural energy that flowed through her veins like liquid fire. When she opened her eyes again, the world looked different. Colors were more vivid, edges sharper, and most importantly, she could see the aura of power that surrounded Adrian like a cloak of midnight blue shot through with silver threads. "I can see it," she whispered, awed by the beauty and complexity of what her enhanced vision revealed. "Your power. It's like watching starlight move through deep water." Adrian's expression grew intense, and Elena caught a flicker of something in his aura that looked like longing before he carefully controlled his reaction. "Excellent. The ability to see supernatural auras will help protect you from deception and allow you to assess potential threats or allies accurately." As her training progressed, Elena discovered that her abilities extended far beyond enhanced vision. She could sense the emotional undercurrents of conversations even when the participants were trying to hide their true feelings. She could detect lies with an accuracy that would have made her invaluable as a diplomat or negotiator. Most unsettling of all, she sometimes caught glimpses of possible futures, brief flashes of events that might come to pass depending on the choices people made. "The sight runs strong in your bloodline," Adrian observed after Elena accurately predicted that Lord Aldrich would arrive with news from the Southern Territories before the vampire actually appeared. "Your grandmother possessed similar abilities, though she learned to suppress them when she chose her human life." Elena couldn't imagine voluntarily giving up the expanding awareness that made her feel more alive and connected to the world than she ever had before. Every day brought new discoveries about herself and her capabilities, and she found herself growing stronger and more confident in her supernatural identity. But her growing comfort with her abilities came with an increasing awareness of the tensions that surrounded her presence at Raven's Hollow. She began to notice the subtle ways certain court members would pause conversations when she approached, or how discussions would shift to safer topics whenever she entered a room. The political undercurrents that Celeste had warned her about were becoming more apparent as her own perceptive abilities sharpened. The situation came to a head during a formal court gathering that brought together representatives from all the major supernatural territories. Aelin had been looking forward to the event as an opportunity to meet vampires and other beings from beyond Adrian's immediate circle, but the atmosphere proved to be charged with tension from the moment the first delegates arrived. Lady Seraphina of the Eastern Court was a creature of ethereal beauty who moved with the grace of flowing water and spoke in a voice like distant music. But Elena's enhanced sight revealed an aura shot through with threads of ambition and carefully controlled hostility. When introduced to Elena, her smile was perfect and her words politely welcoming, yet everything about her radiated disapproval. "So this is the famous Dampier we have heard so much about," Seraphina said, her melodious voice carrying undertones that only Elena seemed to catch. "How charming to see Maria Santos' bloodline active in our world once again." Lord Cassius from the Western Territories was more direct in his assessment. A vampire of obvious age and power, his presence commanded respect even from Adrian's own court members. He studied Elena with eyes that had witnessed centuries of supernatural politics and clearly found her wanting. "She is untrained and unprepared for the responsibilities her bloodline carries." He stated bluntly during a private discussion that Elena's enhanced hearing allowed her to overhear. "Allowing her to remain here sends the wrong message to those who might seek to exploit her inexperience." But it was the delegate from the Southern Territories who proved most disturbing. Lord Damien appeared to be younger than the others, though Elena's sight revealed an aura so dark and complex that looking at it for too long made her feel sick. He watched her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, and she caught him asking pointed questions about her abilities and training that felt more like intelligence gathering than polite curiosity. Adrian seemed to sense her discomfort and made sure she was never alone with any of the visiting delegates, but Elena could feel the weight of their scrutiny and judgment wherever she went. The casual acceptance she had begun to experience from Adrian's own court members evaporated in the presence of these outside observers, replaced by the kind of careful formality that spoke of significant political pressure. The breaking point came during the evening's formal dinner, when the conversation turned to recent developments in human supernatural relations. Reports of increased government interest in unexplained phenomena had the various court representatives discussing strategies for maintaining their community's secrecy. "Perhaps it is time to consider more active measures," Lady Seraphina suggested, her beautiful voice taking on a harder edge. "If humans are becoming too curious about our existence, we may need to take steps to redirect their attention or eliminate the sources of their suspicion." Elena felt her blood run cold at the casual way Seraphina discussed what sounded like threats against human investigators. Surely there must be better alternatives than violence, she said, speaking up despite Adrian's warning look. The table fell silent, and Elena became aware that every eye was focused on her with varying degrees of surprise, disapproval, and calculation. She had just revealed her sympathies in a way that would undoubtedly be reported back to the various courts. How refreshing, Lord Damien said, his voice carrying undertones of mockery. The little Dampier believes we should concern ourselves with human welfare. I suppose that is what comes of being raised in their world rather than ours. Elena felt her temper flare at his condescending tone, and for a moment her control slipped. Power flared around her like an invisible flame, and several of the vampires at the table drew back in surprise. Adrian's hand settled over hers in a gesture that was both supportive and cautionary. Elena speaks from a unique perspective that deserves consideration, Adrian said firmly, his tone carrying the unmistakable authority of his position. Her insights into human nature and motivation could prove valuable in developing strategies that serve our interests without unnecessarily endangering either species. But Elena could see from the expressions around the table that her outburst had confirmed suspicions about her loyalties. In trying to defend human life, she had marked herself as someone whose allegiances were questionable in the eyes of vampires who viewed humans as either food sources or potential threats. The remainder of the evening passed in tense politeness, with Elena acutely aware of every word and gesture being analyzed for its political implications. When the formal gathering finally ended, she felt emotionally drained and uncertain about her place in this complex world. Adrian found her later that night in the castle's gardens, where she had retreated to escape the suffocating atmosphere of supernatural politics. She was sitting beside a fountain, watching moonlight play across the water while trying to process everything that had happened. "I made a mistake tonight," she said as Adrian settled beside her on the stone bench. "I let my emotions override my judgment, and now everyone knows exactly where I stand on human-vampire relations." "You spoke your truth," Adrian replied quietly. "That takes courage, even when the consequences are uncomfortable." Elena turned to study his profile in the moonlight. "Did I embarrass you, damage your position with the other courts?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of centuries. "My position with the other courts has been precarious for decades, Elena. I've never been entirely trusted because of my willingness to consider alternatives to traditional approaches. Your presence here simply makes those existing tensions more visible." "Then maybe I should leave," Elena said, though the words felt like admitting defeat. "If I'm causing problems for you and your court, no." Adrian's response was immediate and firm. "You belong here, Elena. Not because of your bloodline or your potential political value, but because this is where you can become who you're meant to be. Don't let the fears and prejudices of others drive you away from your heritage." His words were comforting, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that her presence was creating complications that could have far-reaching consequences. As they sat in comfortable silence, she became aware of the subtle sounds of the castle around them, conversations in distant rooms, footsteps on stone corridors, and the whisper of supernatural beings moving through the night. But it was a fragment of overheard conversation that made her blood run cold. Voices drifted from an open window above them, speaking in tones too low for normal human hearing, but perfectly clear to her enhanced senses. "The girl is a liability," said a voice she recognized as belonging to Vivienne. "Her sympathies are clearly divided, and her emotional responses make her unpredictable. She could become a serious problem if she decides to oppose our interests." "Perhaps," replied another voice that Elena couldn't immediately identify, "but she is also potentially valuable. Her bloodline carries significant political weight, and her abilities are developing faster than anyone expected. The question is whether she can be properly disguised towards appropriate loyalties." Elena felt Adrian tense beside her, indicating that he too was hearing the conversation. When she met his eyes, she saw a mixture of anger and concern that confirmed her worst fears about the situation she had stumbled into. "They're talking about manipulating me," she whispered, shock and betrayal evident in her voice. "Some of them, yes," Adrian admitted quietly. "But not everyone thinks that way, Elena. There are those of us who genuinely want to see you succeed on your own terms." Elena stood up abruptly, pacing away from the bench as the full implications of what she had overheard sank in. "This was never really about helping me understand my heritage, was it? I'm a political pawn in some larger game that I don't even understand." Adrian rose and moved toward her, his expression pained. "Your education and protection are genuine concerns, Elena, but I would be lying if I said there weren't also political considerations at play. Your bloodline represents possibilities for change that some view as opportunities and others see as threats. The honest admission hit Elena like a physical blow. She had been growing to trust Adrian, developing feelings that went far beyond gratitude for his protection. The idea that her presence at Ravenshollow might be part of some calculated political strategy felt like a betrayal of the deepest kind. "So what am I, exactly?" she asked, her voice bitter with disappointment. "A potential ally? A bargaining chip? A weapon to be aimed at your enemies?" "You are a remarkable woman with extraordinary abilities who deserves to make her own choices about her future," Adrian said firmly.
Yes, there are political implications to your existence, but that doesn't diminish your inherent worth or the respect you deserve.
Elena wanted to believe him, but the conversation she had overheard kept echoing in her mind. How could she trust anyone's motivations when her very presence seemed to generate such complex calculations about advantage and threat? "I need to think," she said, moving toward the castle entrance. "I need to figure out what's real and what's political maneuvering." As she walked away, Elena caught one last exchange between the voices from the window above. "Perhaps we should simply eliminate the complication," suggested the unidentified speaker. "It would be easier than trying to control someone so unpredictable." "That would create more problems than it would solve," Vivian replied smoothly. "But if she continues to prove, uncooperative alternative approaches may become necessary." Elena's enhanced sight flared involuntarily, and for a moment she could see the auras of every supernatural being in the castle. The complex web of loyalties, ambitions, and hidden agendas that surrounded her was overwhelming, but one thing stood out clearly. Adrian's aura blazed with genuine concern and what looked unmistakably like love. The realization should have been comforting, but instead it added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. How could she trust her own feelings when everything around her was so politically charged? And how could she protect both herself and Adrian from the consequences of choices that seemed to carry ever higher stakes? As Elena reached her chambers, she knew that the time for careful consideration and gradual adaptation was over. The supernatural world had made it clear that she was viewed as either an asset to be controlled or a threat to be eliminated. Soon, she would have to decide not just where her loyalties lay, but whether she was strong enough to survive the consequences of her choice. The conversation Elena overheard proved to be the catalyst for events that would change everything. Over the next few days, she noticed subtle shifts in how certain court members treated her, conversations that stopped when she approached, meaningful glances exchanged behind her back, and a growing sense that plans were being made without her knowledge or consent. Adrian seemed to sense her growing unease, and made several attempts to draw her into private conversation, but Elena found herself pulling away. The revelation that her presence served political purposes beyond her personal development had shaken her trust in ways that rational arguments couldn't easily repair. She continued her training sessions and attended court functions, but with a new wariness that colored every interaction. The breaking point came when Elena discovered that her movements were being monitored more closely than she had realized. Using her enhanced senses, she became aware of subtle surveillance. Court members positioned to observe her activities, conversations being reported back to higher authorities, and restrictions being placed on her access to certain areas of the castle. "They're watching me like a prisoner," Elena confided to Celeste during what she assumed was a private conversation in the library. "I think some of them are planning to ensure I don't have a choice about staying here." Celeste's reaction confirmed Elena's worst fears. Instead of surprise or reassurance, the ancient librarian's expression grew troubled and calculating. "Perhaps it would be wise for you to be more careful about expressing such concerns," she said quietly. "There are those who might interpret your desire for freedom as evidence of divided loyalties." The warning was clear. Even Celeste, who had been one of Elena's most supportive teachers, was now viewing her through the lens of political necessity rather than personal friendship. Elena realized that her position at Ravenshollow had shifted from honored guest to potential threat, and that her options for leaving peacefully were rapidly disappearing. That night, Elena made a decision that would change everything. Instead of remaining in her chambers as expected, she used her developing abilities to move through the castle undetected. Her supernatural sight allowed her to avoid the guards and surveillance that had been positioned throughout the corridors, while her growing mastery of her Dampier nature let her move with vampire-like silence and speed. Her destination was Adrian's private study, where she hoped to find evidence of whatever plans were being made regarding her future. What she discovered there was both better and worse than she had feared. The study was empty, but Adrian's desk was covered with correspondence from the various courts that revealed the true scope of the political maneuvering surrounding her presence. Letters from Lady Seraphina demanded assurances that Elena would not be allowed to interfere in intercourt affairs, while Lord Cassius had written to suggest that her abilities be properly channeled toward objectives that served vampire interests. Most disturbing was a message from Lord Damien that hinted at violent solutions if Elena proved uncooperative. But it was Adrian's own notes that revealed the complexity of his position. Elena found draft responses that showed him trying to balance protecting her freedom with satisfying the demands of allies whose support was crucial to maintaining his kingdom's security. He was clearly trying to find a solution that would keep her safe while preserving the political relationships that kept his people protected.
He's trying to save me, Elena murmured as she read through his careful diplomatic language, but he's trapped by his responsibilities to everyone else. A sound in the corridor outside the study made Elena quickly return the papers to their original positions and slip away before anyone discovered her presence. But the knowledge she had gained fundamentally changed her understanding of the situation.
Adrian wasn't betraying her trust. He was struggling with an impossible choice between her happiness and the safety of his entire court. The realization should have been comforting, but instead it filled Elena with a profound sadness. She understood now why her grandmother had chosen to leave this world behind. The supernatural community, for all its beauty and power, was ultimately governed by the same calculations of advantage and survival that had shaped human politics for millennia. Love and loyalty were luxuries that could be sacrificed when larger concerns demanded it. Elena spent the rest of the night walking through the castle gardens, using her enhanced sight to observe the complex web of relationships that governed every interaction between the supernatural beings around her. The beauty of their world was undeniable, but so was the rigid structure that prioritized stability over individual freedom. As dawn approached, Elena made her choice. She returned to her chambers and began packing the few belongings she had brought to Ravenshallow, making plans for a departure that would free both her and Adrian from the impossible situation her presence had created. But her plans were interrupted by a soft knock on her door. When she opened it, she found Adrian standing in the corridor, his expression troubled, and his blue eyes showing the strain of sleepless worry. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. "There are things we need to discuss." Elena stepped aside to let him enter, acutely aware of the packed bag sitting on her bed. Adrian noticed it immediately, and something in his expression crumbled. "You're leaving," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I have to," Elena replied, moving to stand by the windows where she had spent so many evenings watching the supernatural court go about their activities. "My presence here is causing problems that go beyond what either of us can solve. You're being forced to choose between protecting me and protecting your people." Adrian moved to join her at the window, his reflection pale and ethereal in the glass. "There has to be another way. Your grandmother faced similar pressures, but she found a different solution." "My grandmother ran away and hid in the human world," Elena pointed out. "She spent 60 years pretending to be something she wasn't. I won't do that to myself or to you." "Then stay and fight," Adrian said, turning to face her directly. "Help me change the system that creates these impossible choices. Your bloodline carries the power to influence other courts, to push for the kind of progressive changes that could benefit everyone." Elena met his gaze and saw the depth of feeling there, not just political calculation, but genuine love and desperate hope. For a moment she wavered in her resolution. The idea of standing beside Adrian and working to transform their world was appealing in ways that went far beyond political considerations. "What kind of life would that be?" she asked gently. "Constantly fighting political battles, never knowing if my choices are my own or if they're being influenced by the expectations and pressures of others? Always wondering if the people around me see Elena or see the Dampier bloodline that carries political weight." Adrian's expression grew pained, but he couldn't deny the validity of her concerns. "The political aspects would diminish over time as the other courts grew accustomed to your presence. Eventually, you could have the freedom to choose your own path." "Eventually," Elena repeated.
After how many years of careful maneuvering and strategic compromises?
"After how many times of having to put political necessity ahead of personal desires?" She moved away from the window, needing space to say what had to be said. "Adrian, I'm not strong enough for this world. Not yet, maybe not ever. I've only been part of this community for a few weeks, and I'm already feeling overwhelmed by the complexity and pressure. My grandmother had decades to develop the skills and emotional resilience needed for supernatural politics. I'm barely beginning to understand my own abilities, let alone how to use them responsibly in such a complex environment. Adrian's composure finally cracked, and Elena could see the centuries of loneliness and responsibility that he carried, like invisible chains. What if I abdicated my position? What if we left together and found our own path, away from all the political complications? The offer was tempting beyond words, and Elena felt her heart break at having to refuse it. You would regret it eventually. This is your world, your people, your responsibility. You've spent 6 centuries building something important here, and you can't abandon it for someone you've known for less than a month. You don't understand, Adrian said, moving closer to her. I've been waiting for something like this, someone like you, for longer than I can remember. The political implications of your bloodline aren't important to me. What matters is that for the first time in centuries, I've found someone who makes me feel truly alive. Elena reached up to touch his face gently, memorizing the sharp angles and pale perfection that had become so dear to her. And I love you for that. But love isn't enough to solve the practical problems we're facing. The other courts will never accept our relationship as purely personal. They'll always see it as a political alliance that needs to be managed or neutralized. Then we make it work despite their opposition, Adrian said desperately. We find ways to satisfy their concerns while protecting what we have together. Eleanor shook her head sadly. Listen to yourself. You're already talking about managing their reactions, finding compromises, satisfying their concerns. That's not love, Adrian. That's diplomacy. I won't be the reason you have to spend the rest of your immortal life walking a political tightrope. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of everything they were both losing. Elena could see the moment when Adrian truly understood that her decision was final, that no amount of argument or persuasion would change her mind. Where will you go? He asked quietly. Somewhere I can figure out who I really am, separate from bloodlines and political expectations, Elena replied. Maybe I'll find a way to help bridge our worlds that doesn't require sacrificing personal freedom for political necessity. Maybe I'll discover that I'm not cut out for that kind of responsibility at all. But I need to make that discovery on my own terms. Adrian nodded slowly, his expression resigned but still loving. I understand, and I want you to know that whatever you decide about your future, you will always have sanctuary here if you need it. No political strings, no expectations beyond basic friendship. Elena felt tears threatening for the first time since arriving at Raven's Hollow. Thank you. For everything you've given me, for everything you've taught me, and for respecting my choice even when it hurts. There is one more thing, Adrian said, reaching into his coat and withdrawing an ornate silver pendant on a delicate chain. This belonged to your grandmother. She left it behind when she chose her human life, but she asked me to ensure it eventually reached her descendants. Elena took the pendant with trembling hands, feeling the warm thrum of power that emanated from the intricate silverwork. What does it do? It will amplify your natural abilities and provide protection from supernatural threats, Adrian explained. But more importantly, it will help you remember that your heritage is something to be proud of, regardless of what choices you make about how to honor it. As Elena clasped the pendant around her neck, she felt a surge of strength and clarity that confirmed her decision to leave. The supernatural world would always be part of her, but it didn't have to define her entire existence. Will I see you again? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Perhaps, Adrian said, though his tone suggested he understood that some separations were permanent. The world is changing rapidly, and there may come a time when the bridges between our communities require builders rather than guardians. If that time comes, I hope you'll remember that you have allies here. Elena nodded, unable to trust her voice for a proper farewell. Instead, she stood on her toes and kissed him gently, pouring all of her love and regret into the brief contact. When they separated, she could see her own feelings reflected in his ancient blue eyes. As the sun began to rise over the mountains surrounding Ravenshollow, Elena walked away from the castle and the supernatural world that had briefly claimed her. She carried with her new knowledge of her heritage enhanced abilities that would never fully disappear, and the memory of a love that had been real despite the impossible circumstances. Behind her, Adrian stood at his window watching her departure, his expression a mixture of pride and profound loss. He had ruled for 6 centuries, commanded armies, and shaped the fate of supernatural communities across multiple continents. But letting Elena choose her own path was perhaps the most difficult decision he had ever made. As Elena disappeared into the morning mist, both she and Adrian understood that their separation was an act of love as much as one of necessity. Sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was the freedom to become themselves, even when it meant losing them forever. The supernatural world would continue to evolve and change, facing new challenges and opportunities as the human and immortal realms grew ever more intertwined. And somewhere in that changing landscape, the legacy of Maria Santos would live on, through a granddaughter who had chosen to forge her own path, carrying the wisdom and strength of both worlds, without being bound by the limitations of either.